Friends, welcome everyone. So this is In the Movement. We are a monthly webinar series that's coming out of the EJUSA Evangelical Network. And my name is Sam Heath, and I'm the manager of our Evangelical Network. So every month we gather in this space, and the movement we're talking about is the justice movement, and today specifically and especially the death penalty movement. And so we're going to talk with some state death penalty repeal leaders today. So EJUSA is a national organization. We're working to end the death penalty. We're working to think about what does a transformed criminal legal system look like. We talk a lot about what does it look like to build community-centered public safety ecosystems. How can communities be given the tools for safety, and how can they pursue safety, healing, and accountability in ways that don't depend on punishment, which is what our current system depends on. And one of, if not the most wicked expression of that obsession with punishment is the death penalty. And so the Evangelical Network, we're a branch of EJUSA, and we reach out to people of faith, especially Christians and especially evangelicals. So the table is very broad and wide for those to be here and to listen and engage and think. And today we're drilling down into what does it look like to be a state death penalty repeal leader? What does it look like to organize? What do things look like on the ground? And there are 3 states that are a good representation of where things are in our nation about the death penalty movement. And we're going to be able to talk with those people today. So we'll go for an hour. We'll save some time at the end for a Q&A. So anybody listening, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type those into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll come back to those at the end. All right. So our 3 guests today are 3 people in different places and all within this movement. So Stacy Rector is the executive director of Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty and comes from Tennessee, and that's where her work is. Kat Jutras is the statewide advocacy director for death penalty alternatives for Arizona. And Branden Cunningham is director of community engagement at the Nevada Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And Branden, I'm not allowed to say Nevada. Is that right? Okay. I'll make the switch. If I slip up, maybe don't say anything. So again, Q&A at the end. If you all have any thoughts or questions for these 3 individuals, please put that in the chat. We'll send out a recording of this after it's done, and I'll also email all of you here and anybody who registered a link to each of these individuals' websites so that you can see more of their work and reach out to them if and when that would be helpful. Let me talk broadly a bit about the death penalty state nationally, how things are nationally, and then we'll go into Tennessee, Nevada, and Arizona and how things are going there. So the death penalty movement has ebbed and flowed within the United States. Since the founding of this country, we've executed about 16,000 people. And the death penalty was not on the table for a season within the 70s. And since it's come back and began again in the late 70s, we've exonerated 187 people. Or put another way, we've almost murdered 187 individuals since that time. But public opinion for the death penalty has gone drastically down as we've moved out of the 90s and closer to present day. Presently, it's legal to execute within the military at the federal level, but 23 states plus DC have repealed the death penalty. Virginia, the state that I'm coming from, was the most recent state to repeal it. That was last year, and Virginia was the first Southern / the first former Confederate state to do that. So that shows that things are shifting. About 70% of the world's nations have abolished the death penalty, just to give you all a sense of where this fits on a global scale. And right now we want to really dig into what does it look like on a state level. And so you all are coming from different states. If you all want to put in, those that are listening and watching, the state that you're from, that would be great just to see where people are coming from. It's also helpful to think of, in Virginia, we don't have the death penalty, but there's so much justice work that is and needs to be happening. There's a restorative justice program in Charlottesville that we're able to help with. There's a Virginia coalition on solitary confinement that a lot of Christians have come around, even though we've repealed the death penalty. So regardless of your state, there's a lot of justice work that's there. And even if your state doesn't have the death penalty, there's the federal death penalty movement to engage as well. So don't look at this only if you are within Tennessee or Nevada or Arizona. These 3, in a sense, are speaking to this movement as a whole. So let's jump right in with the three of you. First, let's give everybody who's here a sense of what is the death penalty status in your state? We know that it's legal within the state that you're coming from, but how many are on death row? Are there scheduled executions? Is there currently a moratorium? What does it mean to have a moratorium? Give us a snapshot of what things are like.
Sam, would you like me to start?
Yeah, Stacy, if you can start, and then Kat, and then Branden. We'll just go in that order so we don't bump into each other.
Sure. And if I miss something important, you can ask me.
Okay.
But I'll try to hit the stuff that you've asked us to talk about. In Tennessee, currently, we do have a pause on executions, which we're very grateful for. That came about earlier this year in April. We did have 5 executions scheduled for this year. Because of very concerning issues with our lethal injection protocol, apart from the discussion about the drugs themselves and all of the problems that those particular drugs are causing, what was discovered was that our TDOC was not following their own protocols, that we found out about all sorts of stuff that wasn't happening that should have been happening. And the governor, to his credit, we are grateful that he stepped in. It was 1 hour before Oscar Smith was scheduled to die, and stopped it. And then asked some attorneys here independently to look into the problems. And so he stayed all executions here until that investigation can be concluded. Right now, that is through the end of this year. So we are grateful for that. Tennessee was one of the last states to resume executions in the modern era. We did not execute anyone here from 1960 to 2000. Since then, however, we have executed 13. And we have a death row that's an old death row. It's cases from the 80s and 90s primarily. And we are now at 47 on our death row. So we are hopeful that with this lethal injection issue, the state will really take the results of this investigation seriously and slow everything down to make sure a lot of questions get answered. And we're going to work really hard in the interim to continue to lift up not only the issues with the lethal injection protocol, but obviously the larger issues of the systemic failures of the death penalty, to try to help folks here in Tennessee understand this is not something we need. It doesn't make us safer. And it's diverting our resources from the things we ought to be investing in.
Stacy, you named some of the key things that are just the logical arguments against the death penalty, right? Like we know that it does not deter crime statistically. We know that it's applied in a racially discriminatory manner. We know that it's expensive. It's not fiscally responsible, to put it another way. And we know that it's done at times in a torturous manner, or always in a torturous manner. And that's a matter of degree, because you talked about, and can you say more about this for a second? What is the lethal injection issue within Tennessee?
I think there are many. We know we use midazolam, which is the drug that has been flagged as causing pulmonary edema in all the autopsies of people where it's been used. It is, we use a paralytic that's very problematic. I mean, the whole protocol from start to finish is disastrous in my mind. But on top of that, what was determined was that our TDOC, again, we're asking non-medical people, people who I believe have some of the lowest pay in the country in terms of corrections in Tennessee, to come in and basically act as pharmacists and doctors in trying to make something that is completely a non-medical procedure appear to be a medical procedure. And things are just not getting done. Drugs were not being properly tested. They were being left out. They were being stored improperly. The pharmacy was identified, and there were all sorts of problems with the pharmacy and how they were shipping the drugs, and just issue after issue after issue. Because Tennessee is one of those states that has a secrecy law in place, so that all of this is being done in the dark. And for people who do have concerns about government overreach, I think that's something to really think about, is that we are carrying out these things without proper transparency. And we're asking correctional staff to do something they should never be asked to do. So, you know, and there are going to be problems. To our governor's credit, he admitted it and acknowledged it and said we need to address it. Because he didn't have to do that, right? Because again, there's all this secrecy involved. So we're grateful for that, and we're hoping that that commitment to transparency and to really digging deeper into not just the protocols, but the entire system will continue as we move forward.
Let's go further west. So, Kat, let's talk about Arizona. What do things look like and feel like there with the death penalty in your state?
So right now, executions are what I would consider an active status. It had been about 8 years since an execution had happened, so back in 2014, I believe. And our first execution after this long period happened this year in May. And it was the execution of a very seriously ill individual. His name was Clarence Dixon, and at the time of his execution, he was really disconnected from reality, unaware of the reason why he was being executed, and also suffering from blindness. So, and this is how we started our execution cycle here. We have an attorney general in office who is very adamant about pressing the gas on moving forward with executions relatively quickly. We've had 2 executions actually happen, and then we have one that's pending a warrant that will likely be issued in October. That one will be for Murray Hooper, who is 76 and has been incarcerated from the early 80s. So, you know, looking at 40+ years. And you know, right now we have 111 people on death row. Roughly, I'd say 19 to 20 have exhausted all of their appeals. So there is a lineup of individuals that at any time the Attorney General can move forward on a warrant with. So before he leaves office, he's made several statements, very, I guess, concerning, really willing to execute as many people as he can before he leaves office. So it is a dire situation here as far as the activity that we have going. And I think too, because there was this really long pause here, you know, we're gaining momentum as executions happen, but we're wanting to prevent those from happening. So it's a little push and pull in the news. You know, I think that's a really difficult thing here also because of the political environment that we have going on. It's a challenging situation, but unfortunately, I think more executions are going to happen here until we have a turnover of representatives.
Kat, you talked about the Attorney General making statements about these executions and seemingly being on a, you don't have to use the word, but I would have, of a vendetta with these individuals who've exhausted their appeals. What about the governor? What has the governor said about this? How has he spoken about what the Attorney General has called for?
So it's interesting. Our governor appoints individuals to our board of clemency. So when individuals are, their warrant's been issued, they have an opportunity to go in front of this board. And our governor appoints these individuals to this board, which is all former law enforcement professionals. That is the composition of the board. When individuals are going through the clemency process, and if this board grants clemency, the governor then has the opportunity to provide a relief. However, that has never happened with this board. So the governor has never had an opportunity to grant clemency or for us to gauge what his reaction would be if given that opportunity. He's taken a very firm position with the Attorney General, not necessarily on moving forward on executions, but referring back to justice. And that families have waited a very long time for these executions to happen. Just as an example of how much time, the average time most individuals of the 111 on death row, they've been on the row for about 16 years. So it's decades of time that individuals are on the row for in Arizona. But our governor has taken what I would call like a backseat approach by passing responsibility onto this board that he's appointed to, and then reserved himself from having to make decisions, having appointed individuals who are very critical of the people who are going in front and somewhat retrialing them during these clemency hearings.
Kat, you use that word justice, and that's so at the heart of what you three engage, I feel like, every day, of how is it that someone defines justice? What is it that someone thinks brings about justice? If in harm, there's an imbalance in the scales of justice, which I think all four of us would say, where we would all come together in opposition of the death penalty is, what is it that brings back about that balance? I mean, I want people to know that part of what we're working against is this practical opposition to this thing that's happening to individuals. We're also storytelling. We're battling a narrative. And that narrative is this idea that justice is synonymous with punishment, right? Often when we use the word of bringing someone to justice or holding someone accountable, it's synonymous with punishment. And that results in a criminal legal system that is this mass incarceration, prison industrial complex that we have right now. And what I hear you three doing and see you all doing within your roles is practically working against that narrative and saying, no, what justice is and what it really could be is healing. But almost before we can even get to that, we have to stop this violence of the state that's going on. We have to, at minimum, stop executing those individuals and equating justice with execution or with death. So there's that practical piece. There's also that narrative battle. I think about Brian Stevenson talking about with slavery and with the Civil War, saying like there was a winning of the war that was there militarily, but a narrative battle was lost. And that narrative battle is something that we're still working against. All right, Branden, talk to us about Nevada. How are things in this really divided state? Maybe also get into some of that north-south geography and how things are broken down there too.
Yeah, so I guess the quick overview is we basically have a de facto moratorium on executions in the state. Last actual execution was in 2006, and the last attempted execution was in 2014. Didn't go through due to a number of reasons. But at this point, we're over 15 years since our last execution. At current, there's 64 people sitting on our death row. I think we've had it was 72, I think, in 2019 before I started. But there have been a lot of people leaving the row due to various technical issues. I think for folk who aren't from Nevada, Nevada is basically split into Las Vegas and Reno, and then the few people that are scattered throughout rural Nevada. So like state's about 3 million people, 2.2 million of those are in Las Vegas, like another 400,000 is in Reno, and then everyone else is spread throughout our rural communities, whether they be like ranching communities or mining communities. Or I guess there's a couple farming communities if you go far up north. So it's kind of what our state looks like at the moment when it comes to death penalty.
You said it's been since 2006, right? Since there's been an execution. There was an attempted one in 2014. Why would a state, or what are some of the reasons why a state would keep the death penalty if it's not used in a decade and a half? What's the advantage of that? What's the hope of that?
I think broadly speaking, if we look at our coalition as it existed in the past, it was largely run by lawyers. And like great people doing work, but they weren't great at field work. That wasn't their area of expertise. So in the past, our state used to be much, much, much more conservative. If you jump back to the early 2000s, Nevada looked a lot more like Arizona or Georgia. We're like, hey, we just voted for a Democratic president. But if you look at who's in state office, who's in the legislature, it's still fairly conservative. And since that time, we've basically become more and more not conservative. So lots of our state leaders who had been, serving in local office are now in state office or statewide office, grew up during a time where our state was much more conservative. Even if you were a Democrat, you were still on the tough on crime bit. So for lots of those people out of the consulting class that kind of grew up and cut their teeth in that time period, the death penalty was just an issue you didn't speak about. So as the makeup and the political culture of our states changed, their idea of the death penalty hasn't. So it's just been easier to ignore it because no one's doing executions. Sure, we're generating, I think, the third or fourth most new sentences in the country, but no one has to deal with it. And it's easier just to keep the status quo than it is to talk about abolition and potentially have to deal with the electoral fallout, or the perceived electoral fallout.
You three are part of an elite group, in a sense, a small group in your roles in the job that you have, right? We have 50 states, 27 of them are still executing, 23 do not. And not even those 27, all those 27 remaining states, not all of them even have positions like yours. So you're part of a small cohort, right? Helping lead the coalition in the state to repeal its death penalty. So getting to this role, I think, is a crazy and a wild and interesting story. But for each of you, and Branden, let me hear from you first. How did you come into this work? What drew you? Like, what practically got you here? Again, there's not many of the you all out there. So how did you get here?
I can speak on my part. So it's March of 2020, and I was working with an environmental group, and my boss at the time is the coalition's project director. He was my boss at this job, and he had got a new job, new title, like $20,000 pay raise. And we're like, great, that's amazing. You should have left here years ago. And he was like, yeah, I'm with the Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And at the time, our whole field team was like, we have the death penalty? So he starts with them, and then, all the COVID lockdowns and whatnot happen. And I want to say it's around September of that year, he gets a grant, and he's like, hey, so session's about to start in 3 months. Would you like a pay raise? And I'm like, yes, I would. Outside of just getting headhunted for the job, though, also have a long history with multiple members of my family dealing with law enforcement and incarceration. A lot of my family killed and murder and that type of thing. So for me, it wasn't just like, hey, this is a thing that shouldn't exist, but it's a thing that's impacted my family directly. So when I had a chance to really get a win, I thought, well, I can't let go of the opportunity. I've done environmental work for so long, I'm just used to losing, and I was like, I could win there.
What is it about either the work or a particularly egregious aspect of the death penalty that draws you into the work?
I think for a lot of people, there's always the moral component. For me, it was like, yeah, that was there, but it's the absolute policy failure. It's like we have almost 40 years of data showing that it doesn't work. Yeah. That it's not just that it doesn't work, it's that you get worse results in states that have the death penalty, right? Which is they're not correlated, but I'm like, all right, so why do we keep it? And it's really hey, it's just the cultural inertia of this is what we've always done. And that gets to me in addition to all of the innocence cases. Mm-hmm. I know at least in our state, there's 4 or 5 cases that are just egregiously bad. Mm-hmm. I know Nevada has I'm not going to say one of the worst exoneration cases, but it's a case that led to the Supreme Court changing how death row representation is done. How his case was handled was so bad. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's I knew all of that beforehand, and that for me is what makes the death penalty, especially in our state, so bad. Is it's our DA, especially in Clark County, is awful. Not everyone is awful, but that old timey Vegas mob corruption kind of awful. Mm. And I just can't imagine having that and a permanent punishment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that you use the term cultural inertia, right? I mean, one thing I love about this work, I love, ironically, is we can demonstrate this doesn't work, right? All those things that you've said, all those things I said earlier, by any measure, the death penalty doesn't do what people want it to do unless that thing is punishment. And when we can get someone to a place of admitting, I just have a bloodlust for punishment, or I think that balances the scales of justice, that's a really deep place to be. And there's a lot of work and room to speak with someone within that space. But that objective or logical hurdle to get there, that's pretty easy. And it's also frightening, though, to see how tightly people are holding on to the death penalty, given some of these. Well, I can just send you this article. Like if you just Google the death penalty, here are the 15 reasons people want it. None of them apply unless we want punishment. But that cultural inertia, I think that describes that really, really well. Kat, how about you? What got you into this work, into this position? What draws you to something that's really unique?
I think nonprofit work always leads you down these really twisted paths of information. And I got really heavily involved in organizing probably like 6 years ago. I was doing some work for the one campaign around like poverty and preventable disease. And I am formerly incarcerated. It's been about almost 12 years for me. So I never really had like a foot away from knowing what goes inside prisons and knowing the conditions that people are exposed to in Arizona. When the women's prison, we only have one. All the women are put on a maximum security yard when they arrive. And the yard next to ours is essentially where they hold the women on death row. So when I was like 18 years old, I'm, maybe 200 yards from someone who's on death row. And all these stories are spoken about inside your yard or with your cellmate. And it just is kind of this like legend of why these people end up there. Later on, you find out there's plenty of people who've committed violent crimes, murder, who are not on that side. And then you start thinking, why is this so arbitrary of who goes there and who doesn't? One of the big things from just doing this work and working with formerly incarcerated people is hearing the stories of why they ended up in prison, how much time they got, how much time they didn't get, versus like I may run into the same exact person with the same exact crime and they have probation. They never went to prison. There are all these different inequities in the system that are, poverty related, race related, age related, geographically, different, like depending on where you're convicted, you have a higher chance of being on death row in Maricopa County than you do in Yavapai for the same exact crime. So to me, this isn't justice when none of these things are treated equally. And it's not justice when I have the opportunity to meet women and talk to women. And also some of the men on death row who make up the majority here in Arizona, but knowing firsthand the conditions that they're living in and knowing how arbitrary the system is, that if you have money, if you have representation, you could be spared. But if you don't, you're really at the mercy of the court the entire process through, and so little accessibility to how to like represent yourself is accessible to you. So it's not even that you are aware of what's happening as much as you are just being pushed through the system. So like it's very personal to me. I got this position basically by doing volunteer work. I sit on a nonprofit and they said, hey, Kat, I saw this posting. My sister is part of this organization and you should apply for this job. And I said, okay, sure, I have extra time. And so this is, I think, in 2021, I applied, and in this year I got the position. So it was very much like, okay, let's just go. We're going to work on this. I feel like Branden in a way of there's a lot of political work I've done and giant issues that are just as challenging, but it takes decades to push. Not to say death penalty doesn't, but this is a tangible, very well documented, I guess like a issue that we can win. And it has been shown that you can win in really difficult states, to like move social issues. And to me, this is sometimes a politicized issue, but at the end of the day, it is a social issue. It is a social construct of how we view punishment and justice. And, I think that generationally, that also is something that becomes easier and harder to talk about. I find that there are a lot more people interested in going, okay, well, why did these people end up there versus they deserve to be there? That conversation I've had time and time again, and I go, let's go all the way back and start looking at like victims. Most of the individuals on death row here have been victimized in some way, whether that had been early childhood development issues, substance abuse, mental health, like all of these things. It wasn't just one thing that got them there. It was multiple breakdowns in the system. So, and I've seen it so many times, witnessed it myself and been a part of it, that it was easy to say yes to this job and move into something that is exponentially difficult every day, but just so rewarding in the sense of that you're fighting for something that you can change.
Al Tariq Best is the head of a group in Newark, New Jersey called The Hub, and he has the phrase of hurt people, but healed people heal people. And I hear an echo of that in what you're saying. I also think about, we've said already today that 27 states still have the death penalty, but it is only a handful of counties that actually use it. And I think that's something that's really important for people to realize, that if a state has the death penalty, it's not as if there is a full public or full county engagement within that. It's actually very few places. And you said this, Kat, depending on where your capital case is and what county, it becomes increasingly likely or less likely, depending on geography, whether you receive the death penalty, which literally is unconstitutional, that this is being applied in this arbitrary way. And we talked about how it's applied in this discriminatory way. The number one predictor of whether or not someone receives a death penalty sentence is the race of the victim, of the person that they harmed. So just with those things alone, I think just with those logical reasons, my hope is people, even if they hold a category for the death penalty, if they think a nation could do it well, or for Christians, if they think that there is a biblical argument for it, the fact that we're not applying this in a way that is safe, that is equitable, that is even effective by any measure, itself is reason to halt. Stacy, what about you? What was your road to this position, and what draws you to this really special and weighty work?
Well, I have to say, I kind of got teared up listening to Kat and Branden because, for them to say this is winnable, and it is. And it's just so inspiring to me to have folks coming into this movement with their experiences that are able to say that and mean it and know it. I've been around a long time. And, it's just so wonderful, and I love it. And I'm so grateful to both of y'all and for your stories of how you got here. My journey just started. I'm a Tennessean by birth. I knew we had a death penalty, but it never got used while I was growing up. And in college, I began to do some ministry with kids in the Memphis community and began to see interface with the justice system, particularly for Black kids, and ask questions about that. And I was wrestling with my faith and went to seminary in Georgia where they were actively executing in the early 90s, and became involved with writing to people on death row and some prison ministry. And Dead Man Walking came out during that period, those of you who are familiar with Sister Helen's amazing film. And so all of these things were just really, I felt God speaking to me about this issue. And I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with that. But when I came to Tennessee, back to Tennessee in 97 to serve a church here, Tennessee was just beginning to really talk about seriously restarting executions. It was 1997, the tough on crime mantra was strong. We had a governor that was saying we need to start up executions. And so I kind of landed here as this young pastor, kind of fired up and ready to talk about why that shouldn't happen. Unfortunately, it did a few years later, but I was immersed in the conversation at that point and began to, through a volunteer program, visit someone on death row in 1999. So I always talk about the fact that it's my faith that brought me to this and continues to keep me doing it. Otherwise, I couldn't do it. I believe this is God's work that I've just been invited along to participate in. And you know, as long as I have that passion, I will continue to do it. And as feel I can do good and move us toward that goal, I'll continue to do it. So I think my faith is what brought me to it. Personal relationship with my friend Steve Henley on death row, who I served as spiritual advisor for when he was executed in 2009. And frankly, so many of the surviving family members of murder victims who have taught me and continue to teach me so much about, you know, the horror of homicide and what is available to them on the other side of that, and what are the real needs that they have, and whether they want the death penalty or don't, the system is failing them. Mm-hmm. And we know that. And so the learning, I've just grown tremendously in my own humility around not always having the answers, but knowing we can do a lot better than we're doing. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I would say, as Branden and Kat both have named so well, the policy piece. You know, once you dig in, once you do the homework and the research, what you learn is this thing is a failure. It's not working. It's ineffective. It's costly. It's taking our eye off what we need to be focused on, which is prevention, which is support for people who've been harmed. And, you know, like you said, Sam, punishment is basically it. That's all that there is to it now, retribution and punishment. There is no gain. Nobody's safer. Nobody's healthier. Nobody's supported. You know, it's just, you go down the list of all the myths we have about what the death penalty is supposed to do, and it does none of it. It mm-hmm. punishes. Mm-hmm. And it's very arbitrary about who those people are, right? So anyway, that's what got me here. I've been doing the work in some fashion since probably around 95-ish, but became the director of TDP in 2006. So next month will be 16 years as the director of TDP, which blows my mind. I'm like, where did that time go? But I've seen a lot of really amazing progress. And yes, it's like this, you know, but I feel like we go kind of up, we move up and down, but the trajectory overall is up.
Right.
But there are hard days ahead, I know, and we just have to support each other and keep doing the work and keep mm-hmm. doing the work.
Mm. Stacy, how was being Steve's spiritual advisor and accompanying him through that journey up through execution? What kind of marker was that for you in your story, in your work? What did you take away from that? How did that change any ways that you engage the work?
I mean, obviously, I'm sure it did, you know, because you can't really go through something like that and not be completely changed.
Yeah.
You know, I always say, and I told Steve this, he is one of my teachers, and his life and his death continue to inform the work that I do. You know, what I also recognize is the trauma that is involved with anybody that touches this, particularly those who are present. I would be very surprised if any person involved did not come away with trauma, mm-hmm. whether they thought it was the right thing to do or not. Mm-hmm. It was an ugly, ugly, ugly thing. The process did not go according to what they had hoped, and it was very tough to be there. So yeah, I still have, you know, I know I have trauma from that. And when executions come around, I have to really do some deep prayer, meditation, preparation, knowing that that stuff's going to come back up. But again, I do think it gives me an insight into it that I carry with me that continues to motivate me. That no one should go through that. No person on death row, no family,
Yeah.
no correctional staff, no attorney, no media witness, nobody should go through that and have to be a part of that. So in that sense, it continues to inform the work.
I want to remind everybody watching, any questions that you have, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll come to those with at least 10 minutes or so left in our time and make sure we get to those. All three of you are in states that are at very different points you shared within the death penalty, right? Kat, you said you're in an actively executing state. There have been 2 this year, likely a 3rd before we get to Christmas. Stacy, you're in a state that has a recent moratorium, and Branden, yours hasn't executed someone since 2006. So what does it look like? Branden, I'd love to hear from you first. What does it look like to build a coalition around death penalty repeal, given those very different points that each of your states is at? What does that look like in Nevada?
So I know for us, it's a lot of it's mostly education around the issue. Most of our progressive and left-leaning orgs, even a lot of conservative orgs that we've spoken to, just didn't know we had a death penalty. They just assumed at some point they had gotten rid of it, and they just didn't get the memo. So a lot of the work we do is just educating, having groups come in, speak to their members, answering questions. And honestly, for us, that does like 90% of the work. I know we have an execution that is in limbo, and as bad as it sounds, it's been a huge boost to outreach, because people are hearing about, oh, hey, we're executing someone. I thought we got rid of the death penalty, and then they find us. So, a large part of it, it's really just education in our state. So many people just don't know we have it. And once they learn that we do, it's usually it's not even a process of educating them about the issue. Usually they're like, oh, wow, it's bad because of this, that, and the other reason. How do we still have it? So at least that's how it's been in Nevada. I don't want to say it's easier, but our org only has 2 people, so.
Well, you touched on something that makes sense just with knowing humanity, right? That once there was an individual, a person's face, a person's story, it became different work. I mean, that storytelling, that narrative telling aspect is huge. Some of my best conversations with people about the death penalty are working to help humanize this from being less of an issue and more about something that is connected directly to people. It makes me think of Oklahoma. So Oklahoma has scheduled out 25 executions, about 1 a month over the next 2 years. And the Pardon and Parole Board recommended clemency for that first individual. The governor ignored that and has now gone down the road of executing those individuals. There are 24 people remaining. The next individual has his date, and that's upcoming. And a lot of the work there is, yes, they want a statewide repeal or moratorium, but they also are storytelling about these individuals and saying these are humans with people who care about them. And even if there aren't people who care about them and someone's not been visited in 20 years, that these are humans, these are human beings, and we have a connection with that. And here is that person's story. Here is their trauma, which doesn't excuse what they did, but it really helps explain it. And it helps us understand and see that connection. So that's a huge piece. So what you're saying, I hear that makes sense. Kat, what about for you all in Arizona? What does it look like to build a coalition in a state that is actively executing people?
I'd say education also is one of the biggest pieces we have ahead of us. Also, this state is ultra conservative when it comes down to this issue. Polling here hasn't immediately indicated that this is something we can get done in the next couple years. I think because we've had a recent example, and unfortunately it seems like immediate examples of executions that are happening draw people's attention to the subject. If it's not happening, it's kind of like a distant thought. And, I hate that is, how I think people kind of function. I do it too. If it's on the news, I go, oh my gosh, that's awful. But for us, the execution of Clarence Dixon was so awful in the regard of this individual had a very long documented history of mental illness. And I think that created more of a conversation of how do we prevent this from happening again? And that being a first step that we're taking to really work and focus on a campaign on education around mental illness, incarceration, and then ultimately really what happened to Clarence statistically could happen to anybody geographically with a mental illness. If they're in Maricopa County, something awful happens. This shouldn't be, and it shouldn't be for anybody. But the first, chunk that we can really kind of chip away at is working towards an SMI exemption bill. And it has been successful in Ohio and Kentucky. They're very similar politically, political environments to Arizona. So this is something that we can do a lot of education on. We can build coalition partners in the mental health community and the faith community. And, I think that's something people can relate to. Anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, these are all, I think conditions people can relate to. So that'll be, where we'll focus a lot of our work in the next year is providing education and building relationships with organizations around this issue.
And Stacy, what about for you? You've been in a state that's been executing. Now there's a moratorium. What does coalition building look like there in this unique hiatus moment?
Yeah, and we've been doing it for a while, so that's helpful. And like Kat was naming, we've worked on severe mental illness for several years, and so we have a large coalition of mental health organizations and criminal justice reform organizations that have been working on that issue. We pivoted in 2021 to work specifically on intellectual disability and modernizing our state's definition and allowing people already on the road to have access to some relief because of that. And the disability community was huge in taking the lead and really moving that bill to passage. So, obviously the mental health, the disability communities are hugely helpful and places to build coalition. Also racial justice organizations, other organizations working on broader criminal legal reform. We're doing a lot more work there in making those connections. We just worked with a coalition of groups in Shelby County and Memphis, Tennessee, around educating about the role of prosecutor. And we're excited that those policies were supported by the majority of people who voted. And so that there is now a DA with a different frame for looking at how to do justice, as you said, Sam, what that means in Shelby County. So that's been huge. And obviously our conservative work in a state like Tennessee is enormous.
Yeah.
We have a new conservative coordinator. We have a coordinator for community outreach doing a lot of our racial justice outreach and outreach to the victims advocacy community. And now we have a new conservative coordinator beginning that work, continuing to do the outreach to conservatives here, and really helping remind conservatives what conservative values are around fiscal responsibility, pro-life policies, and limited government, which the death penalty is inconsistent with. I will say our community outreach coordinator, who herself has lost her son to gun violence a few years ago, has been incredibly important in connecting us with the victims advocacy community and really finding the common ground there in terms of how the system's failing to support victims. And in her research, we've determined Tennessee is pretty abysmal in our support of compensating victims, families, surviving families. And so we're going to be working on some legislation to address that, because we think, obviously, if you're told that this is all you have, the death penalty, to give you finality and make you whole, then it makes sense that you might hold on to that for dear life, right? But if the state is actually looking at what your needs are and addressing those in a real way, then that need to hold on to something like that, that's only doing damage to everybody, is going, in my opinion, to be lessened because someone is listening, someone is paying attention to what you really do need. And so we're excited about the work in the victims advocacy community, and really seeing where that goes. So I think you can find partners everywhere because we talked about how broken the system is. And there's a reason for people from many walks of life, many perspectives to find a reason to say this thing needs to go, and it's just finding them and bringing them in.
I love the parable that Danielle Sered, who leads Calming Justice, talks about. And she shares that imagine a hamburger stand within a desert and it serves terrible hamburgers, but yet there's a line a mile long for that hamburger stand. And the hamburger stand says, we have the best hamburgers in the world, obviously, right? Look at the line that's coming there. And she says, that's our criminal legal system. It's the only thing that's offered in what feels like a desert. And because people are lining up to engage it, it speaks as if it's a good thing when it's rotten to the core. That's true of the death penalty too, right? That's not the only option that's there to actually pursue a true definition of justice. There are other things and other options. I see a lot of our work as an invitation to people's imaginations to imagine something else, right? People are satisfied. Like Branden, you're talking about there, like people didn't know that the death penalty was still there. Well, let's remind people that it is. Let's also present this other thing. If we remove something, then we need to make sure something else is present. And people need to feel and to know that because people's longing for justice is good. That's human. I think that's instilled. But how that desire is met is what we are trying to say. It's not this thing. This thing of executions will never satisfy. Not only is that logically true, but in talking with murder victim family members who've gone through that experience, I've never heard someone say, I'm satisfied, this gave me what I needed. Which doesn't mean somebody hasn't, but that is not a common experience at all, to feel that fulfillment. I want to move to what'll be our last question for the three of you. And Stacy, I'll start with you because I'm looking at the Q&As that are there. So someone was asking about what denomination that you're a part of. And I'd add on to that, how does your denomination think about executions? And then what does it look like to engage faith communities within the state? And then Kat, we'll hear from you about engaging faith communities in Nevada and in Arizona, and then Branden in Nevada, and then we'll start to close out our time.
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief so everybody gets a chance to respond. I'm a Presbyterian. I'm a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. And thankfully, the Presbyterian Church has had a position against the death penalty, I want to say since the 50s, and they've over the years sort of updated it and revised it, but it continues to be opposed. Now, does everybody in the pew know that? No. And that's, again, part of that education process. And the faith community, obviously, in a state like Tennessee is huge. I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention's headquarters are here. There are many different denominational centers and going on here in Tennessee, and actions going on here in Tennessee. So we're sort of a hub for a lot of faith communities. So their impact is critically important. And so we're constantly engaging faith communities. They're wonderful places to educate people, to plug in, get people educated, and then give them the tools to do something. That's that next piece. It's important to educate them, but we got to give them the tools to then do something about it. And so, I think the faith community is right for that. And once people sort of understand what's happening, I have found, and it's kind of across the board. I mean, even denominations who do have pro-death penalty positions, when you educate folks about just how broken the system is, they may, like you said, Sam, biblically, they may continue to hold a pro-death penalty position from a biblical perspective, but from a practical, does it work? And is this something that is actually healing and doing justice? They can get there, right? And so that's really hopeful. And I find that, but we have to, in my mind, approach it from where's our common ground? Where are the things that we as people of faith can agree? And then let's start there and build out from there. And I feel like we are making real progress there.
Kat, faith communities and engagement within Arizona, what does that look like?
So there's actually been an outpour of support, and that's an exciting. That's just exciting. I don't have a religious background. I grew up in a very atheist home, so it's honestly kind of like, oh, I think I should go to church more often. These are good people. But you know, for the last execution, Frank Atwood was extremely devout to his faith, and his entire community showed up for his clemency hearings. The whole overflow room was filled, and to see that kind of support for someone within their community is so huge. You know, there were efforts made to the Attorney General, who was Greek Orthodox, and his whole faith commitment was Greek Orthodox. And you know, I just saw a huge, tremendous effort from that community. We had our first vigil in a really long time, and we had tons of people there from different faith backgrounds. And you also see leaders of color wanting to get more involved from the faith community. And I think that it's just an incredibly important part of coalition building, is to be inclusive of all faiths who want to be involved in this. But here, you know, they know that it's going to be a fight. And you know, I think the leaders who I've spoken to and have seen attend our events, they're committed to that fight and helping us kind of build the advocacy that we need to stop this here in Arizona.
And Branden, what about Nevada, the faith community involvement and rallying them?
So I'll say Nevada might be a little different than some of the other states. Nevada does not have many churches per capita compared to lots of other states, not just like in our region, but nationally. So lot less of a faith community there to organize. And what I'd say is we've had, and this was like in other positions and in this position too, I've always had difficulties organizing some of our churches. Primarily, they act a lot like our nonprofits do, where they're really siloed off, working on whatever their pet project is, and it's hard to rope them into larger projects because they tend to be focused on whatever their ministry work is, and they tend not to participate in broader issues, not just like statewide issues, local issues, but even issues that happen in their community. So we've had some successes organizing them. It's just a really insular community. So some faith communities, it's just like, if you're not a part of us, don't speak to us. And some are a lot more open and inviting. So it's just been kind of trial and error trying to find the right in. But from the folk who are engaged, really, really great partners.
Let me say two things to close our time. One is, if I asked you all this question, I'll give at least a form of an answer and a way for you to all to answer it later. How can people get involved? Again, anybody who's registered or come here, I'll send a recording of this. I'll also send all three of y'all's websites and contact info so people can reach out to you with more questions, especially if they are from your state. If those of you that are from states other than Nevada and Arizona and Tennessee want to engage the movement, you are welcome to reach out to me, and I can help connect you to any of the justice and death penalty work on a national level and or within your state. And the last thing I'll say to the three of you is thank you and blessings. And press on. I incredibly respect the three of you and work with you all to varying degrees, and want to continue to do that, to accompany you in that work, to do what I can to offer our support. But at the beginning, just a thank you for what you slog through, for what you encounter, for what you bear, for what you are working for, and for this vision of light and hope that justice is. There is movement, there is hope, and you all are the vanguard of that. So please know that you are seen and cared for and thought about and prayed for, and blessings on your work. So thank you for sharing of your experiences and your ups and downs today. I think this was invaluable. So thank you three so much.
Thank you, Sam, for the good work you're doing and for bringing us together. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all. All right. Well, we'll send out a recording. We'll send out